Look at him now, the great Kelechi Eze, owner of half the warehouses on this waterfront. The man who once told a whole boardroom that patience was for people without money. Look at him now, strapped to a hospital bed, tubes in his arm, machines breathing for him when he forgets to breathe for himself. He cannot lift a finger, he cannot open his mouth, he cannot even blink on command, the doctors say. And the beautiful part? He can hear every single word we're about to say about him. He just can't do anything about it. So let's not waste the opportunity. Let's talk business, brother. Let's talk about who gets what now that the great Kelechi Eze is finally quiet. If a story like this keeps you glued to your seat, hit follow now and turn on notifications, because what happens in the next 20 minutes will make you question every loyal person sitting at your own table. Let's get into it. He never said out loud, not even to his wife. The theory was this: the moment a man's account balance crosses a certain number, the people around him stop being people. They become weather. They shift with the season of his fortune. Sunny when the business is booming, stormy the day a shipment is delayed, and gone entirely the day the money runs dry. He was 45 years old and he ran Eze Logistics and Maritime Holdings, a company that moved cargo along 300 kilometers of Nigerian coastline and inland by truck to a dozen states beyond it. His father had started it with 2 canoes and a death he never fully explained. Kelechi had turned it into fleets, warehouses, a private jetty, and a name that made port officials straighten their collars when they heard it. He was not an unkind man. He built a primary school in his father's village. He paid the hospital bills of employees who never asked him to. But somewhere beneath the generosity sat a colder, more practical organ, the part of him that watched people's eyes when they thought he wasn't looking, that noticed who asked about his health and who asked about his holdings. His younger brother, Chuka, had never forgiven him for being born first. It showed in small ways: the joke that landed a little too sharp, the silence that followed every one of Kelechi's achievements. His business partner and right hand, Uche Basse, knew the company's accounts better than Kelechi knew his own reflection, which was either deeply reassuring or deeply dangerous, depending on the day. His family lawyer, Barrister Fola Adeyinka, held the deeds to every property Kelechi owned on paper and off it. His cousin Ngozi had a taste for imported handbags that her salary at the company could never explain. And then there was Papa Basse, no relation to Uche, just an old friend of Kelechi's late father, a retired chief who knew Kelechi since he was in short trousers, who still called him my son, in a voice thick enough to drown suspicion in syrup. Only one person in Kelechi's orbit never once asked about the business: his wife, Zainab. She had married him back when the company was 3 trucks and a rented office, and she had never once looked at the empire he built the way the others did, like something to be divided. Kelechi did not know it yet, but the coastline he loved so much was about to swallow the ground beneath his feet. It started as these things often do, with a celebration. His 45th birthday. The Eze compound in Lekki was lit up like a stadium. Caterers, a live band, family flown in from 3 continents. Kelechi moved through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing at jokes he'd heard 100 times, accepting envelopes he would never open. 3 weeks earlier, something had begun troubling him. Small tremors in the company's accounts, a container that never arrived, a warehouse insurance policy quietly doubled without his signature, a private line of credit opened in the company's name that he had never authorized. He'd hired an outside auditor quietly and told no one, not even Zainab. The auditor had called him 2 nights before the party, his voice tight with something between fear and urgency. "Oga," the auditor had said, Somebody inside your company has been building a second business with your money. I need 1 more week to trace where it leads. Kelechi never got the chance to hear where it led. At the party, his cousin Ngozi brought him a cup of chilled zobo, insisting he tried before the crowd finished it all. He drank half of it between conversations, distracted, laughing. By the time the cake was cut, his hands had begun to shake. By the time the band played its last song, his vision had folded in on itself like paper. He remembers falling. He remembers Zainab's scream cutting through the music. He remembers Chuka's face hovering above him, and for one strange suspended second, before the world went dark, he remembers that his brother did not look afraid. He looked like a man watching a door finally close. He woke inside his own skull. That was the only way Kelechi could describe it to himself later, in the silence of the night that followed. He was awake. He could hear the soft complaint of the heart monitor, the squeak of nurses' shoes on the tiled floor, the murmur of a television in the next room. But his body would not answer him. Not his fingers, not his eyelids, not his tongue. He tried to scream, and nothing moved. He tried to cry, and even his tears refused him. The doctors called it a rare toxin-induced paralysis. His body had survived the poisoning, but the poison had left something behind, a kind of locked door between his mind and his limbs. They could not say if or when it would open again. They used a word that terrified him more than any of it: vegetative. They said his hearing might be compromised, his cognition uncertain. They said the family should prepare for the possibility that the man they knew might not come back at all. 2 nights after the poisoning, Kelechi heard footsteps stop beside his bed. A voice he knew, Chuka's, dropped low enough that a passing nurse wouldn't catch it, but not low enough to escape a brother who could hear everything and show nothing. Doctor said his brain might be gone, Chuka murmured to someone standing with him. If he doesn't wake up in the next month, the board can appoint a caretaker director. You know what that means. The other voice answered, and it took Kelechi a moment to place it. Barrister Fola. It means, the lawyer said quietly, it means whoever holds power of attorney holds the company. A pause. Then Chuka's voice again, colder than Kelechi had ever heard it. Then, let's make sure that document is ready before he wakes up, if he wakes up. The footsteps retreated, the door clicked shut, and Kelechi Eze, unable to move a single muscle in his body, made the only decision left available to him. He decided he would never let them know he was still in there. The recovery that followed was not really a recovery. It was a performance, and Kelechi had a month inside a hospital bed to rehearse it. His neurologist, Dr. Adeaze Wogu, was the only person he trusted with the truth. When feelings slowly began creeping back into his fingertips, first a twitch, then a shaky grip, then halting steps with a cane, he begged her in whispered fragments during a private examination not to tell his family how much progress he had truly made. They think I can't hear them, he told her, forming the words with enormous effort. Let them keep thinking that. I need to know who did this to me. Dr. Wogu studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then, we will document your recovery as minimal. Officially, you remain severely impaired. Unofficially, you and I both know better. When Kelechi finally returned to the Lekki compound 6 weeks later, he came home in a wheelchair he no longer strictly needed, wearing a blankness on his face that he had practiced in a hospital mirror until it felt like a second skin. He let his eyes drift past people without focusing. He let his mouth hang slightly open. He let Zainab guide his hand to sign forms he pretended not to understand. The house had changed in his absence, not physically, but in its air. Staff spoke around him in hushed, exaggerated tones, the way people speak around furniture. His housekeeper, Iyabose, a woman who had worked for the Eze family for over 20 years and feared nobody, not even Kelechi, muttered under her breath while adjusting his pillows. "Ah, Oga," she said one evening, not knowing how clearly he understood her. Just last year, you were shouting at the gateman for closing the gate 1 minute late. Now you cannot even complain when I overcook your rice. God changes people's story quick. Kelechi wanted more than anything to laugh. Instead, he stared at the wall and let her believe the joke had died with the rest of him. The trick, Kelechi discovered, is that grief and greed sound remarkably alike from a distance, and the only way to tell them apart was to watch what people did the moment they believed no one was watching. Chuka arrived most mornings with paperwork, guiding Kelechi's limp hand towards a signature line with practiced patience, narrating gently to the empty air, "This is just for the insurance, brother, nothing to worry about." Then he would step into the hallway and speak in an entirely different register. "The transfer papers need his thumbprint by Friday," Kelechi heard him say into his phone one such morning. "Once that's done, the board can't touch us." Uche Basi, his business partner, visited with company files stacked under one arm, walking Kelechi through the warehouse ledgers as though reading a bedtime story to a child. "You built all this from nothing, Casey," he said, and something in his voice cracked with what sounded almost like guilt. Later that same week, Kelechi, wheeled into the study and left alone as everyone assumed he would be, overheard Uche on a call in the corridor, his voice pitched with fear rather than triumph. "I told you I'm not signing anything else," Uche hissed. "If something happens to my family because of this, I go to the police myself." Kelechi filed the words away. Uche did not sound like a man enjoying his spoils. He sounded like a man drowning. Ngozi visited often, always dressed a little too well for a woman on a company salary, always glancing at the antique clock on the mantle or the gold bangles in Zinab's jewelry box with an appetite she could not quite disguise. One afternoon, she leaned close to Kelechi's blank face and whispered half to herself, "At least you won't remember what's missing from that box." That night, Kelechi noticed, through eyes that saw far more than anyone credited him for, that 2 of his mother's old bracelets had vanished from the cabinet. And Papa Basi, the family elder, came and went with his warm hand resting on Kelechi's shoulder and his warmer voice promising again and again that everything would be all right. "Trust in God, my son. Trust in family." It was the kind of sentence Kelechi had heard 1,000 times before the poisoning and never once questioned. Now, hearing it from inside a body that could not react, he noticed for the first time how carefully rehearsed it sounded. 3 weeks into his silent surveillance, Kelechi found a folded note tucked beneath his pillow. "You are not as far away as they think. Be careful who you trust with your silence." His pulse spiked. He searched the room as best his still recovering body allowed, under the bed, behind the curtains, inside the wardrobe. No one. Whoever had written it had walked in and out of a room he supposedly never left unattended and had known with total certainty that the great Kelechi Eze was still listening from behind his own eyes. 2 nights later, Iyabosi came in with his dinner tray, and as she set it down, she said something so quietly that even the microphone of his own paranoia nearly missed it. "You are not as gone as you pretend, Oga." He stared at her. She met his eyes, really met them, for the first time since the accident, and something like relief passed across her weathered face. "I raised children in this house before you were even engaged to Madame," she said, straightening his blanket with brisk, unbothered hands. "I know when a man is sleeping and when a man is only closing his eyes. Eat your food. We will talk when it is safe." That conversation, held in whispers over a bowl of pepper soup 2 days later, gave Kelechi his first real ally. Iyabusi told him she'd noticed his flinch at certain names, his tension at certain footsteps. She told him about a driver, his own driver, Tunde, who had grown skittish and sleepless since the party, jumping at shadows, refusing to be alone in the garage after dark. "That boy knows something, and it is eating him alive," she said. Tunde had driven for the Eze family for 6 years, long enough to know every mood in Kelechi's voice and every pothole on the Lekki-Epe Expressway. He was also, Kelechi came to learn, a frightened young man carrying a weight far too heavy for his 26 years. One evening, wheeled out to the garden for air, Kelechi caught fragments of a phone call Tunde thought no one could hear. "I only did what you told me. Change the ratio in the drink, nothing more. Nobody said anything about poison strong enough to put a man in a coma. If he dies, that's not on me alone. Kelechi's hand, still weak, curled slowly into fists in his lap. So, Tunde had been the hand. But whose voice had guided that hand remained hidden behind the static of a phone call cut short. 2 nights later, Tunde vanished from the compound entirely. Chuka told the family he had absconded after being caught stealing fuel vouchers. Kelechi, watching his brother's face as he delivered this explanation, did not believe a single word of it. It was Ngozi, ironically, who broke first. She came to Kelechi's study one afternoon and, believing herself entirely unheard, confessed everything to a man she thought could not understand a syllable. She admitted to taking the bracelets, to selling them to cover a debt she was too ashamed to name aloud. She cried real tears, the kind that surprised even her. "I know I am greedy," she whispered, "but I did not do this to you. Whatever happened at that party, it was not me." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added something that made Kelechi's blank stare sharpen behind its mask. "The person I saw leaving the drinks table before you collapsed wasn't the caterer. It was Papa Bassi's driver." A knock interrupted her before she could explain further. She deleted whatever she had typed on her phone and fled the room, unaware that she had just handed Kelechi a thread he would spend the next month pulling. Around that same time, an old family friend named Damilare, a man who had once joked too often about how lucky Kelechi was to have married Zainab, disappeared without warning. His car was later found abandoned near the lagoon, a photograph of Kelechi and Zainab's wedding inside, her face circled in red ink. Everyone assumed the worst of him. But when Damilare finally resurfaced weeks later, exhausted and afraid, he confessed he had been threatened into silence by a man wearing a brass compass pendant, an old symbol, he said, of a shipping guild long since dissolved into something far darker. Damilare admitted his jealousy of Kelechi's marriage was real, but insisted with tears in his eyes that jealousy was the only thing he was guilty of. Someone simply found his weakness and turned it into a weapon aimed at someone else entirely. Meanwhile, Zainab had not spent her husband's silence sitting still. She had quietly hired a private investigator the week of the poisoning, telling no one, not even her mother-in-law. She traced the mysterious line of credit the outside auditor had flagged before his own sudden unexplained disappearance. She found wire transfers routed through a shell company registered in Uche's late father's name, a company Uche swore he'd never activated. She planted a small recorder in the garage after noticing strange late-night visits to a locked cabinet there. And one night, Kelechi, trailing his wife quietly through the compound on legs stronger than anyone knew, watched his own wife retrieve that recorder from behind a shelf and whisper to herself, "Please let this be enough to end it." For a dizzying moment before he understood, he had wondered if his wife might be part of the very conspiracy trying to bury him. He was never more relieved to be wrong. The compass kept surfacing, a brass pendant, an old maritime symbol stitched into whispered conversations Kelechi wasn't meant to hear. His mother, more withdrawn since the poisoning than anyone had noticed, finally broke her silence one quiet evening when she believed her son could not understand anything she said. She told an old story to the empty room, the way people sometimes confess things to the dead simply to be free of them. Years before Kelechi was born, his father had a partner, a sharp, brilliant man named Tobina Idigu, who had helped build the earliest version of the shipping business from a rented dock and a stubborn dream. Tobina had disappeared under a cloud of accusations, embezzlement, betrayal, disappearance. And the story passed down through the family was simple. Tobina had robbed his father blind and fled the country in shame. But Kelechi's mother, speaking now to a son she believed could not hear, told a different story. Tobina hadn't stolen anything. He and Kelechi's father had discovered together that a small circle of powerful men wearing that same brass compass, members of an old maritime trade guild twisted over decades into something closer to a cartel, were funneling stolen port revenue through fraudulent shipping manifests. When the two men threatened to expose it, the guild destroyed Tobina's name to silence him, and not long after, Kelechi's father died of what the doctors called a sudden illness. She had never believed that either. Kelechi absorbed this in silence, real silence this time, born not of performance but of grief. His father had not simply died, he had been erased, the way the guild was now trying to erase his son. He found Tobina 2 weeks later, living quietly outside the city under a different name, an old man with tired eyes and a spine that still refused to bend. "You look like your father," he told him, Everyone says that like a compliment. From where I'm sitting, it's a warning. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself, ugly and undeniable. Uche Basi, Papa Basi's own nephew, not merely his namesake, a fact Kelechi had never once thought to question, had been slowly bled dry by gambling debts, and the guild had offered to erase them in exchange for quiet cooperation, moving shares. He cooperated and hated himself every day since. Chuka, drowning in business loans he'd taken out to prove himself independent of his brother's shadow, had been promised a caretaker directorship if he simply stayed patient and let the recovery drag on. Barrister Fola had drafted the guardianship papers that would hand control of Eze Logistics to whoever the guild chose the moment a doctor certified Kelechi permanently incapable. Ngozi's theft was convenient chaos, left alone deliberately, a useful decoy suspect to keep the family's suspicion pointed anywhere but upward. And at the very top, patient, warm-voiced, endlessly reassuring, stood Papa Basi, the man who knew Kelechi's father, who comforted his mother at the funeral, who sat beside Kelechi's hospital bed promising everything would be all right. It was Papa Basi who inherited leadership of the old maritime guild decades earlier. It was Papa Basi who ordered Kelechi's father silenced when he threatened to expose the port fraud. And it was Papa Basi who, watching a second generation of Eze men grow too curious, had ordered a driver to slip something extra into a cup of zobo at a birthday party. The final proof arrived through Barrister Fola himself, who, worn down by months of guilt and Zainab's quiet, patient persuasion, finally agreed to hand over a recording he'd secretly made during a guild meeting. In it, Papa Basi's voice, unmistakable, laid out the plan in his own words: incapacitate the heir, force a legal declaration of permanent impairment, seize control through the very trust his father had built to protect the company, and finish what had been started with the father one generation earlier. Papa Basi resurfaced through a single message sent to Kelechi's phone. Bring the original shipping ledgers your father hid. Come alone, or Tobenna doesn't leave this jetty alive. Kelechi knew it was a trap the moment he read it. He went anyway, because some debts cannot be settled from a safe distance. Zainab refused to be left behind. Uche, desperate to prove the confession Fola had recorded didn't tell the whole story of his own conscience, insisted on coming too. Iyabose arrived last, handbag slung over one shoulder, informing everyone flatly that she had worked for this family for over 20 years and had every right to see how the story ended. And before anyone asks, she added, patting her bag, "Yes, I am carrying pepper spray. I did not bring a fan to a gunfight." The old jetty at the edge of the Eze family's original dock was dim, lit by a single swinging bulb over crates that hadn't moved in decades. Papa Basi stood at its center, calm as ever, Tobenna bound to a post beside him. "I knew you would come," the old man said, smiling the same smile he'd worn at 100 family dinners. "I already know you can hear," Kelechi answered, his voice steady for the first time in months. "So, let's not waste either of our time." Something in Papa Basi's expression flickered, recalibrating but not afraid. He told Kelechi everything, almost proudly, the way men do when they believe they've already won. The poisoning, the guilt, the decades-old cover-up of his father's death, the deliberate manipulation of every frightened, indebted, jealous person in Kelechi's circle. "Each of them was a piece I moved," he said. "Your amnesia was never a tragedy to me. It was the key that unlocked your father's trust." "I was never gone," Kelechi said quietly. "You just needed me to be." Outside, headlights swept across the water. The police Zainab had quietly arranged days earlier alerted the moment Fola's recording confirmed enough for a warrant. Papa Basi bolted for a side exit and ran directly into Iyabose, who raised her canister with the calm of a woman who had broken up worse fights over stolen yam. "Old man, your legs still work. Use them somewhere else." He shoved past her anyway and vanished briefly into the maze of crates. But there was no boat waiting this time, no second escape route the guild hadn't already lost. By the time the tide came in that night, so did the police. And for the first time in 30 years, the man who quietly controlled an entire shipping empire from the shadows had nowhere left to hide. The trial did not take as long as anyone expected because the evidence, once it finally surfaced, left almost nothing to argue with. Fola testified. Tunde, found weeks later hiding upriver, testified too, insisting through tears that he'd never understood how far the plan was meant to go. Uche handed over 3 years of falsified ledgers he'd secretly been preserving as insurance against this exact outcome. Damilare stood in open court and admitted without flinching that his jealousy had made him easy to use. Ngozi paid back what she'd taken piece by piece over the following year. Tobena finally placed his father's original shipping documents into evidence, the same papers he'd protected for 30 days at the cost of his name and his freedom. Kelechi's mother told her story publicly for the first time, and it landed on the courtroom the way old grief always does, quietly and then all at once. Papa Bassi said very little in his own defense. There was, in the end, very little left to say. Kelechi did not simply return to his old life once the trial ended, because the old life had never really existed the way he remembered it. It was a stage set, built on a foundation he'd never bothered to inspect. He restructured the company from the ground up, building financial controls that didn't soften for a shared surname. He forgave Chuka, eventually, though forgiveness and trust turned out to be two different currencies, and he made his brother and the second one back in installments the same way any debt gets repaid. Uche stayed on, his loyalty tested harder than any audit could test it, and passed. Ngozi, to everyone's surprise, became a genuinely successful businesswoman in her own right and never looked twice at another woman's jewelry box again. He used part of his fortune to find the families whose stolen port revenues funded 30 decades of a guild's quiet cruelty, compensating what could still be traced, funding scholarships for children whose grandparents had lost everything to men wearing brass compasses at private dinners. He built a small maritime training center at the old jetty, on the very ground where he'd once stood in the dark negotiating for an old man's life. He wanted that water to mean something other than fear. He visited his father's grave alone one evening, the way he meant to for months, and kept postponing. "I understand now," he said quietly to no one who could answer him. Then he walked back to the car where Zainab was waiting. Kelechi used to believe wealth was a kind of harbor, a safe, still place where a man could finally stop bracing against the waves. He learned in the cruelest way possible that wealth is not a harbor at all. It is open water. It draws every kind of vessel towards it, the honest fishing boats and the pirates alike. And the only thing that determines which is what they do the moment they think no one on shore is watching. He had once feared a simple, humiliating question. If the money vanished tomorrow, would anyone stay? Silence, in the end, had answered it for him more honestly than any conversation ever could have. Some people had abandoned ship the moment the water got rough. A few, his wife, an old housekeeper with a sharp tongue and a sharper instinct, a partner who chose conscience over comfort, a brother who eventually chose blood over fear, had stayed and bailed water beside him until the storm passed. Those were the ones who became his real fortune, not the warehouses, not the jetty, not even the name his father had died protecting. Years later, whenever someone asked Kelechi Eze about the month he supposedly couldn't hear or speak, he rarely mentioned the poison or the guild or the trial that once filled front pages. He would simply say the silence had taught him how to listen, and let people assume it was a joke about his recovery. It never was, because the richest man on that stretch of coastline had once let the whole world believe he was gone, and in that borrowed silence, he had finally learned to hear who was building him a future and who was only waiting to divide his past. That's the story of Kelechi Eze, the man they thought was gone, who was listening the entire time. If this kept you hooked till the very end, don't scroll away yet. Like this video, drop a comment telling us who you suspected first, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next one, because the next family has secrets even darker than this one. See you there.